Living next to someone can make you feel safe. But what if the person next door has a hidden darkness lurking in their life? Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to see a shadow behind your curtain, but no one is there. Is it your mind playing tricks on you, or is something far more sinister going on? This is the story of a woman who realized her seemingly normal neighbor was hiding a terrible secret. Email ****. This story was sent by Emma S., a woman who experienced something truly horrifying with her neighbor. It started off so innocently. I had just moved into a small apartment in a building with a few other tenants. I didn't know anyone, but there was one neighbor who seemed kind enough. Her name was Mrs. Jenkins. She was an older woman, always polite and friendly when we crossed paths in the hallway. We'd wave, exchange pleasantries, and that was about it. But then, things started getting strange. Late one night, I woke up to a noise. It was faint, like something scraping against the wall. I thought it was just the usual creaks of the building settling, but then I noticed something odd. Through my window, I could see the faint silhouette of someone standing behind the curtain of Mrs. Jenkins' apartment. It was late, too late for anyone to be up. I thought it was probably just her, perhaps looking out the window. But then I saw something that chilled me to the bone. The shadow didn't move. It remained perfectly still, standing there for hours, and that's when I realized something wasn't right. The next morning, I ran into Mrs. Jenkins in the hallway, and she greeted me with a smile. I couldn't help but ask, "Were you up last night?" She seemed confused and said, "No, I was sleeping." "Why do you ask?" I shrugged it off, but that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept watching her apartment window, half expecting to see the shadow again. And sure enough, there it was, standing motionless behind the curtain. I started to feel paranoid, so I decided to confront her. I knocked on her door, but when she answered, there was no shadow in her apartment. I told her about what I had seen, but she just smiled and reassured me that it was probably my imagination. But deep down, I knew I was imagining it. That's when I decided to do some digging. I asked around and learned that Mrs. Jenkins had a history of strange behavior. Neighbors who had lived there longer told me stories of her talking to herself in the middle of the night and always closing the curtains, even during the day. They also mentioned that she had a family member who had mysteriously disappeared years ago, and no one had ever been able to explain what happened. I never saw the shadow again after that, but I moved out shortly after. There was something deeply unsettling about Mrs. Jenkins, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had witnessed something I wasn't supposed to. To this day, I can't help but wonder if that shadow was her or something else entirely. Clapperboard ***outro***. Sometimes the things that happen behind closed curtains can't be explained. If you ever feel like something's not right, trust your instincts. Some neighbors have secrets that can chill you to the bone. The silent neighbor ***. Neighbors can either be a blessing or a curse. Sometimes the person living right next door may seem friendly, but their silence may hold a terrifying secret. It's easy to assume that everything is fine until strange things begin happening, and you realize that the truth is far darker than you imagined. Email ***. This chilling story was shared by Sarah P., who had a terrifying experience with a neighbor she thought she knew. Description: I moved into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The houses were spaced out, with yards full of trees and little gardens. It was the perfect place for someone like me, someone who preferred peace and solitude. But little did I know, my quiet life would soon be shattered by the person living next door. At first, everything seemed normal. My new neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was an older man in his 60s. He kept to himself, never really spoke to anyone, but he always greeted me with a polite nod whenever we crossed paths in the yard. He lived alone, and his house was always dark, the curtains drawn tightly, never revealing much about what was happening inside. Over the first few weeks, I started to notice strange things. Late at night, I would hear the sounds of furniture being moved around, followed by what sounded like soft mutterings or whispers. But whenever I checked, Mr. Thompson's house was always silent and still. I didn't think much of it at first, just typical old house noises. I assumed. One evening, after coming home from work, I walked past his house, and noticed something different. The curtains were drawn back, and for the first time, I could see inside. I froze when I noticed what was sitting in the middle of his living room, an old rocking chair. But it wasn't just a chair that caught my attention. It was a figure sitting in it. The figure was hunched over, almost skeletal, with long, bony fingers curled around the arms of the chair. It looked as if it had been there for hours, maybe even days. And as I stood there, unable to look away, I noticed something even more disturbing. The figure had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where its head should have been. Suddenly, I heard the creak of the front door open behind me. I turned to see Mr. Thompson standing in the doorway, watching me. He didn't speak, but his eyes were cold, almost as if he were daring me to say something. Without thinking, I walked away quickly and locked myself in my house. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in that chair. Who or what was it? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faceless figure sitting in the chair, just waiting. But when I looked out the window at Mr. Thompson's house, the curtains were closed again and everything was dark. The next morning, I decided to confront Mr. Thompson. When I knocked on his door, he answered with a faint smile, but something about him seemed off. His eyes were vacant, almost lifeless. I asked him about the figure in his house, but he denied everything. He assured me that I was just imagining things. But as I looked into his eyes, I could see the faintest hint of something dark, something he wasn't telling me. I left his house and tried to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled in my chest. But as days went by, I couldn't escape the growing unease. It wasn't long before I discovered that Mr. Thompson had lived in that house for years, and before that, he had lived in several other homes in the neighborhood. In every home, the same strange occurrences followed: whispers, figures in the dark, and the unsettling feeling that something was always watching. I decided to move out a week later. The thought of staying in that neighborhood with Mr. Thompson and whatever haunted him made me feel trapped. To this day, I still don't know what happened in that house. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that rocking chair was something far more dangerous than Mr. Thompson. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't Mr. Thompson who was watching me. Sometimes, the people we think are harmless are hiding things far darker than we can imagine. If you ever feel like something is off with your neighbor, trust your instincts. They might be hiding something much worse than you think. The whispering neighbor, asterisk. We've all had neighbors who keep to themselves, but what if one of those neighbors had a secret? A secret that could change the way you see your quiet street forever? Sometimes, the silence of your neighbor's home isn't peaceful at all. It's hiding something far more sinister. Email *credit*. This chilling story was shared by Michael R., who had a terrifying experience that changed his view on the quiet life forever. Do you have a spooky or unsettling neighbor story? Share it with us, and it might be featured in an upcoming video. Details are in the description below. I had just moved into a small, quiet town on the edge of the forest. The neighborhood seemed like the perfect place to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. My house was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by old oak trees and neatly kept lawns. My neighbors, as far as I could tell, were friendly but kept to themselves. My neighbor to the left was an elderly woman named Mrs. Green. She was in her late 70s, but she had an aura about her that made her seem much older. She never went outside during the day, and I hardly ever saw her leave the house. At night, though, that's when things got strange. Every evening, around midnight, I would hear soft whispers coming from her house. It was faint at first, so I thought maybe it was just the wind or the sound of the old house settling. But the whispers grew louder and clearer with each passing night. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like a conversation, a low, murmuring dialogue, but there was no one outside. No one was supposed to be there. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my imagination, but the whispers became a constant presence. They would drift through my windows, unsettling me even as I tried to fall asleep. I couldn't understand what was being said, but there was something inherently wrong about the tone. It felt as though someone was standing in a room with me, talking just out of earshot. One night, I decided I had to find out what was going on. I waited until the whispers began, then crept across the yard to Mrs. Green's house. The lights inside were dim and the curtains were drawn, but I could still hear the voices. I walked up to her front door and gently placed my ear against it. What I heard chilled me to the bone. The whispers were not just soft murmurs anymore. They were voices, clear and distinct, and they were talking about me. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but every now and then I heard my name. My blood ran cold when I realized that they knew everything about me, things that I had never told anyone. I stepped back, too afraid to knock, and hurried back to my house. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided I needed to confront Mrs. Green about it. I knocked on her door in the afternoon, but when she answered, she looked perfectly normal. No sign of what was happening inside. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mrs. Green," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I've been hearing some strange noises from your house at night. I just wanted to make sure everything's all right." She smiled at me, her eyes dark and distant, as if she were looking right through me. "Oh, don't mind the noises, dear," she replied in a soft, almost motherly voice. "Sometimes I have guests over. They don't like to leave." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't press further. I gave her a polite smile and quickly left her doorstep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, the whispers grew louder than ever. But this time, I wasn't going to wait outside her house. I decided to call the police. When they arrived, they searched the house thoroughly, but there was no sign of any strange activity. The officers found Mrs. Green alone, sitting quietly in her living room, knitting a scarf. But when they left, I was standing in my yard, staring at her house when I saw it. A shadow moved behind the curtains. Just for a split second, I couldn't make out any features, but the outline was unmistakable, a tall, thin figure, staring back at me from inside her house. From that day on, the whispers never stopped, and every night, they seemed to grow louder, like they were drawing closer to me. I moved away soon after, but even now, every time I hear whispers in the distance, I feel that same cold chill. I never saw Mrs. Green again, but I still hear her whispers in the dead of night, faint, but always there. And sometimes I wonder if it's not just her talking, if it's not just her guests. Clapperboard asterisk outro asterisk. Sometimes the quietest houses hide the loudest secrets. If you ever hear whispers in the night, you might want to think twice before you go looking for the source. What you find could be more than you bargained for. Not all neighbors are friendly. Sometimes, behind the facade of a smiling neighbor next door, lies something far darker. Imagine living next to someone who always smiles but never speaks. Someone who's always watching, but never shows their true intentions. This is the terrifying story of a man who moved into a new house, only to realize that his neighbor wasn't what he seemed. Email *credit*. This story was shared by Brian M., who moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood only to realize his friendly neighbor was hiding a dark secret. Have you ever had a strange or creepy experience with a neighbor? Share it with us, and we may feature it in a future video. Details are in the description. I had just moved into a new house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The area was peaceful, the streets lined with oak trees, and the houses were all identical. Everything seemed perfect, or so I thought. The first time I met my neighbor was when I was unloading boxes from my car. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a pleasant smile. His name was Mr. Fletcher. He introduced himself and welcomed me to the neighborhood. I thought it was nice, especially since I was new to the area. Days went by, and I would often see him sitting on his front porch, staring out into the street. Sometimes I would wave and he'd wave back, but there was always something odd about his gaze. It was like he was watching me, always observing me, but never speaking. One night, I couldn't sleep. There was an unsettling feeling in the air, so I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. As I walked down the street, I passed Mr. Fletcher's house. His porch light was on, and there he was, sitting in his rocking chair, staring at me. I waved, but he didn't respond. That's when I noticed something. His front door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see inside. A figure was standing in the hallway, just out of sight. The figure seemed to be waiting for something. Suddenly, I heard a faint voice from behind me. "You're up late, aren't you?" It was Mr. Fletcher, standing in his porch, now much closer to me than I had remembered. I nodded nervously and excused myself, walking quickly back to my house. But as I entered my house and locked the door, I heard a knock. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then the knock came again, louder this time. I looked through the peephole. It was Mr. Fletcher, standing there with that same unsettling smile, his eyes wide open and fixed on mine. He said nothing, just stood there staring. I didn't open the door. I didn't know what to do. Eventually, he turned and walked back to his house. I waited for hours, making sure the house was locked tight. I never saw him the same way again. To this day, I don't know what Mr. Fletcher wanted, or why he was watching me so intently. All I know is that I moved away from that neighborhood soon after, and I never looked back. Clapperboard **outro**. Sometimes, the people who live closest to us are the ones with the darkest secrets. What would you have done if you were in this man's shoes? Would you have opened the door,